Coming up on The World Today, Mali's interim president announces a new prime minister. Well, staying with new, Israel gets a new president as the country awaits announcement of a new government by the opposition coalition. Plus, U.S. President Joe Biden makes history in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A warm welcome to our viewers here in Nigeria and around the world. I'm Amarachi Ubani here in Lagos. We begin in Mali, where interim leader Colonel Assimi Goita has named a new prime minister. He is Chogwell Kokala Maiga, leader of the M5 RFP movement, which led anti-government protests last year over rising insecurity, alleged corruption, and a failing economy. Goita was at the emergency meeting declared by ECOWAS over the weekend and has said nothing about the regional body's decision to suspend Mali because of his actions the previous week. As vice president then in the interim government, he detained the president and prime minister for making cabinet changes replacing two senior army officers without involving him. Both leaders finally resigned. Both the African Union and ECOWAS have said that they have suspended Mali and they want a civilian government restored. Meanwhile, Ugandan police have released a CCTV footage showing yesterday's attack on the vehicle carrying the country's transport minister. The video shows four men on two motorbikes, one of them wearing a blue striped T-shirt. One of the bikes in the video makes a U-turn not far from the scene of the attack before disappearing into a petrol station. It's believed they had been following the minister's vehicle for some distance before the attack, and none of their faces is clearly identifiable. The army says it is looking into phone calls that seem to have been made to plan the attempted assassination. And we're still awaiting word on whether or not there will be a coalition government at the end of the day. In the meantime, in Israel, Parliament has elected former center-left politician Isaac Herzog as the country's new president. A 60-year-old Herzog was first elected into parliament in 2003 and then went on to lead the Labour Party and hold several portfolios in coalition governments. His most recent public post was as head of the Jewish Agency for Israel, which encourages immigration. He was defeated by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu back in 2015, but has been picked as president as his former nemesis faces possible toppling by a cross-partisan alliance of challengers. Herzog is a lawyer by profession and is son of late Israeli President Chaim Herzog, who also served as his country's ambassador to the United States. In the meantime, head of the International Committee of the Red Cross has called on Israel and Palestine to find a political solution so the violence, like last month's hostilities over the Gaza Strip border, might be prevented. During his first visit to Gaza in 4 years, Mr. Robert Mardini toured areas devastated by Israeli bombardments during the 11 days of fighting, including a road where 42 people were killed. According to medical officials in Gaza, at least 253 Palestinians were killed by Israeli airstrikes, while rockets and missiles fired by Palestinian factions killed 13 people in Israel.
It's really heartbreaking to see and to hear about the people who paid the ultimate cost of this escalation, women, children, civilians who were living safely in their apartments and were caught in this rubble that we see behind us. It is really heartbreaking.
I'm going to stay in this region just a bit more. Residents of Gaza can tell you stories for days about how they survived and experienced the horrors of the 11 days of fighting with Israel. Those who were children when this all started in conflicts past are now suffering from more post-war trauma with the most recent violence. Take, for instance, 22-year-old Rahav Al-Ahak, who is one of them. She recalls some of her experience.
The worst experience I went through during this aggression was during the first day of Eid. It was after 12 p.m. There were severe bombings all over the area. 100 warjets were actually bombing all of Gaza Strip. You have to see your siblings, the little children, terrified, which in itself actually is very painful, because you see these children going through all of this. It might cause them PTSD. They are terrified by the sounds, and yet they're really young. They shouldn't really be going through all of this. Personally, having to comfort my young sister during the aggression was really heartbreaking, because she starts clinging to me, moving nervously, trying somehow to let out all of the fear she's experiencing.
Let's bring in Khaldun Barghouti, a journalist in Palestine who's interestingly an analyst on Israel. Khaldun, thank you for joining me on the program. Let's begin with the ceasefire and how that is holding up on the side of Palestine. Is Palestine keeping its part of the deal?
First, well, it's not the whole Palestine. It's the Palestinian factions in Gaza. And it's not a deal, by the way. It's a simultaneous ceasefire that was declared by both sides without reaching a deal. The deal is being discussed now with interference by Egypt and other Arab and foreign countries. It has a lot of, let's say, branches in this deal. We're talking about reconstructing the destruction caused by the Israeli aggression on Gaza. We're talking about raising the siege that has been imposed on Gaza in the last 15 years. And we're talking about the prisoners swap deal between Hamas and Israel, where there are 4 Israeli soldiers and civilians captured in Gaza, and there are thousands of Palestinians in the Israeli prisons. All these things should be discussed now, mainly in Cairo, in Egypt, in order to find a political and a humanitarian solution for the crisis in Gaza. Also, even the Palestinian split is being discussed in order to find a solution that could bring a comprehensive package to end the whole crisis in the region.
Yeah, and there is no time limit to the ceasefire. There is no time limit at all. And all of these must be ironed out before that deal must be produced. Thank you for bringing that up. Those who experience the fighting, though, in Gaza are speaking out on the impact it's having on their mental health. For example, Rahav's story. Is that common in Gaza from what you're hearing for most of the population? And what is the rhetoric that exists in Palestine regarding Israel at the moment?
First, there are a generation in Gaza that lived 4 wars between 2008 until the last war last month. And those people are in shock, in fact. They need maybe psychological care. They don't have maybe enough resources, enough institutions that would provide this help. When I see, for example, that guy who was under the rubble and he heard his mother last words, then she died, and he couldn't do anything for her. Or that man who lost all his family, and he's now having only the 4 months child who survived the bombing of his grandfather's house, where they were all there to celebrate the feast, even it was war. So yes, we're talking about thousands of people who are suffering these wars without being taken care when it comes to the psychological situation. What people in Palestine are talking about the situation concerning Israel, it's the same as Israel is an occupation force that is practicing military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza, and also practicing a very racial discrimination policy toward the Palestinians who became Israelis by de facto in Israel itself. All these practices, every Palestinian agrees that it is led by the Israeli government, regardless who lead this government or these governments in Israel. They are practicing racism against the Palestinians, whoever they are, whether they were citizens in Israel, whether they living in Jerusalem, in West Bank, and in Gaza. This is what every Palestinian agrees on, and maybe there are differences on how to deal with this between different factions, but in general, most of the Palestinians are seeking freedom, to get rid of this occupation and to live in dignity and peace.
I think I kind of agree with you about nothing really changing, because the man who could be taken over from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Naftali Bennett, is a supporter of Prime Minister Netanyahu's annexation plans in Gaza. So really nothing changing there. But we're learning today that Israel intends to ask the United States for at least $1 billion to replenish the Iron Dome that was damaged during the fighting. Before the ceasefire was announced, there was a lot of diplomatic shuttle by Western leaders to Israel, also to Palestine, and also to Gaza, and many promises were made. So how does Palestine feel? What's the feeling you're getting learning that Israel is still going to get military help, from these Western allies, despite carrying out more attacks on Palestinians in Gaza, when you compare that to the promises that were made by these nations about rebuilding Gaza?
Well, we're used to the U.S. support to Israel. Every year there are more than $3 billion in military and economic support to Israel provided by U.S. United States of America. This is something that not new for us. When Gantz is going to ask for $1 billion. We remember that the Iron Dome is like a joint project between United States and Israel, and the United States is interested in keeping Israel superior on the military level in the Middle East. But with all, let's say, the political movements in the region during the last escalation, we see a little bit positive change in the international arena concerning the Palestinian people. We don't think that statements or visits will solve our crisis living under occupation, but we see that the image of Israel became terribly bad during the aggression. We saw that in the Congress, for example, it was a first that they wanted to vote whether to support Israel or to provide military support to Israel or not. We saw journalists in the White House asking the spokespersons of the U.S. Administration that when you talk about Israel right to self-defense, what about Palestinian people right of self-defense? They are living under occupation. Israel is launching a war on demand. They have the right to self-defense themselves. So even the discourse concerning the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is a little bit changing. An Israeli ex-spokesperson for the Israeli army said in an article that when it comes to the hashtag war, Israel lost that battle, and the result for Israel was zero. They lost that battle on social media platform. So we are feeling that there is a change. It's good, but it's not enough yet. We need to see the countries who have been involved in the recent weeks. And after the escalation, we want positions, not only practical positions, not only statements. Statements doesn't end the occupation. What can you do on the ground? What kind of real pressure you can put in Israel can make change? Statements are not enough.
Khaldun Baghouti, thank you again, for joining us on the program and letting us in on your thoughts. And we also are concerned about the people who have to live through, these conflicts. Thanks again.
You're welcome.
We have more stories coming up on The World Today, including this one. Well, now that they've been given the go-ahead to have more kids, will the people of China take this opportunity? Oh, we'll find out when we return. Stay with us. Welcome back to The World Today. The UK government's vaccine task force says latest coronavirus data in the country looks encouraging, but there needs to be a balance to discuss on ending restrictions by June 21st. The UK on Tuesday announced 0 COVID-19 deaths for the first time since the pandemic began. The Prime Minister believes there is nothing suggesting the lifting lockdown cannot go ahead. Here's a global update.
And also we don't...
You had separated the same person?
Yeah. The UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he will be cautious in lifting coronavirus restrictions. However, it's still unclear how protected the population would be against the new surge of COVID-19 cases should lockdown end as planned in June. Mr. Johnson had previously warned that the swift spread of the B.1.617.2 variant of concern, first identified in India, England's COVID-19 restrictions on the 21st of June. Today he seems sure that will not happen.
I can see nothing in the data at the moment that means we can't go ahead with step 4 or the opening on June the 21st, but we've got to be so cautious because there's no question the ONS data of infection rates is showing an increase. We always knew that was going to happen. Don't forget, we always said that the unlocking steps that we've taken would lead to increases in infection.
Stretching several blocks outside the facility. Places like Kadrin have been a driving...
Across the pond to the United States, the total number of confirmed COVID-19 cases has surpassed 33.28 million, with the death toll exceeding 595,000, according to the Center for Systems Science and Engineering at Johns Hopkins University. The United States still leads the world in the number of COVID-19 cases and deaths. Meanwhile, India's COVID-19 tally rose beyond 28.3 million cases today, with 132,788 new cases reported in the past 24 hours. Compared with the record of 414,188 new confirmed cases in a single day reported on the 7th of May, India's daily increase in confirmed cases has dropped significantly, with the growth rate down by nearly 70%. The number of daily active cases has been on the decline over the past few days, after a continuous surge since mid-April. Finally, AstraZeneca says it will soon deliver to Thailand the first 1.8 million doses of its COVID-19 vaccine produced by a firm owned by the Thai king amid anxiety over vaccine supplies prior to a mass immunization program due to start next week. Thailand has 6 million doses of AstraZeneca vaccine available, among 61 million doses ordered, which are to be manufactured locally by Siam Bioscience, a company owned by the Thai king that is making vaccines for the first time.
U.S. President Joe Biden on Tuesday became the first sitting U.S. president to visit the Tulsa, Oklahoma site where hundreds of black Americans were massacred by a white mob in 1921 as he marked the country's legacy of racial violence. President Biden oversaw a moment of silence for the victims after meeting with 3 people who lived in the district during the massacre: Viola Fletcher, Hugh Van Ellis, and Leslie Benningfield Randall, and then toured a museum dedicated to the incident. His administration plans steps to combat inequality. They include efforts to expand federal contracting with small, disadvantaged businesses, invest in tens of billions of dollars in communities like Greenwood that suffer from persistent poverty, and pursue new efforts to combat housing discriminations. Public awareness about the killings in Tulsa on May 31st and June 1st, 1921, which were not taught in history classes or reported by local newspapers for decades, has grown in recent years. White residents shot and killed up to 300 black people and burned and looted homes and businesses, devastating a prosperous African-American community after a white woman accused a black man of assault, an allegation that was never proven.
For much too long, the history of what took place here was told in silence. My fellow Americans, this was not a riot. This was a massacre. I come here to help fill the silence, because in silence, wounds deepen. And only, as painful as it is, only in remembrance do wounds heal.
China wants to grow its younger population. That may come as a surprise to some because the country has always allowed a a one child per couple and only changed it to two about a few years ago. But now the government says it will be allowing couples have up to 3 children and will be supporting measures to help prove its population structure, actively respond to the aging population, and preserve the country's human resource advantage. It sounds good, right? But what will that entail for the people?
Babies. Almost every couple dreams of having them, raising them and watching them grow. But when a government restricts how many you can have to 1, then 2 and now 3, it can be a bit confusing how to navigate becoming a parent in China. News of China's decision to allow families have up to 3 children has been met with uncertainty from Chinese residents and calls for details on what promised support measures will include.
Because we're living in a big city such as like Beijing, the workplace is fast and it isn't easy to make money. The cost of time is also high. If there is a 3rd child, you will spend more time raising your children. Meanwhile, you need to work. So I think it isn't all realistic. In terms of implementing the 3-child policy, I think only super rich families might have the aspiration to have a 3rd child because they have more money to raise children, like to hire other people to take care of them. But from my perspective, a typical well-off family like us won't do it.
Women in China already face a widening gender gap in terms of workforce participation and earnings, and have borne a growing share of childcare duties as state-supported childcare has declined, according to a report last year by the Peterson Institute for International Economics. For couples like 31-year-old products designer Yu Tao and his 28-year-old wife Liu Xingchang, changing their current routine is asking a lot. Both are not thinking of having babies because of the impact it would have on their career. Both are part of a demographic trend that has the Chinese government worried. China had a fertility rate of just 1.3 children per woman in 2020, recent data showed, on par with aging societies like Japan and Italy, and far short of the roughly 2.1 needed for replacement level. The government's policy shift on children has been met with skepticism. The high cost of raising children in urban China, where housing can be expensive and children undergo private tuition in addition to private schools amid a fierce competition education system, are common reasons cited by people as deterrents to having kids. But the government says it will improve the public interest childcare services to reduce costs for families on raising children. China intends to boost its population, as experts warn that any impact on China's population, such as decline, could have vast effects on other parts of the world.
Well, you have to agree with me, those kids are really cute. Thanks for watching The World Today. I'm Amarachi Ubani.